This battle froze all living things in inexpressible horror. It seemed as if the sky itself had descended to the earth, painted in mournful dark colors. The rocky terrain where the massacre took place was covered with the bodies of dead monsters and people. Everything was mixed together in one heap. Scaly dragons, human remains were burning in the fire, which moved from body to body in cheerful tongues. From the highest cliff, stones danced in the air from magical attacks, and a soft blue glow reached into the sky. The blood of the fallen flowed in streams from the demon's huge, forked blade. The monster was pleased with itself. There was only one human left. The demon seemed to be made of the blazing flame that was his essence, a grin playing on his face as his clawed hand reached out to the man, sensing a quick victory. The demon, without even getting close to the victim, with one movement plunged the sword straight into the man's chest, knocking the victim off his feet. But the weapon the man desperately clutched in his hand had long since shattered into pieces. Blood gushed from the young warrior's mouth and he coughed violently, trying to breathe air through his punctured lungs. The guy, with the last of his strength, rose up on one knee, leaning on the broken sword, and opened his right eye, as if he wanted to destroy the demon with one glance. This world has come to an end. It has been a year since people have been defeated in the war with demons. The human race has remained in the minority in this battle. Violent fires and monsters that amaze the imagination with their incredible size and power destroyed entire cities. The surviving humans became vessels for the birth of monsters. They were buried in layers of webs, like the corpses of tiny insects. But as the last survivor of the resistance, the blonde, stately warrior continued to fight until he met the main demon. From head to toe, clad in hellish armor, with his horned wings folded behind his back, he stared fixedly at the man bowing before him. The warrior knew the one who mortally wounded him. It was Tartaros, the Demon King. Tartaros looked mockingly at the dying man, as if he had just noticed that he was in pain, and offered his help. A yellow light shone on the outstretched claw, and a tangible spell of prolonging life force appeared. It snaked around the boy's body, giving him short moments of rest, because the demon wanted to chat a little with his toy. Tartaros initially addressed the warrior impersonally, but then remembered his name, Jeffir. The king turned around, clasping his hands behind his back, and told him that Jeffir was the first one to bother him so persistently, and praised him for his persistence. They say that he who fights without a chance of winning is foolish. With these words, Tartaros walked past the boy who was gritting his teeth, continuing that those who surrendered, afraid of the enemy's strength, are not wise. Eyes blazing with hellish fire darted towards the man, cutting off the fact that such people are fools. Tartaros bared his teeth. He was incredibly angry when he saw such a weak and impatient trash. Jeffir, the strongest of people, should understand him. The grin faded from the demon's face as he looked down again to offer the boy a daring deal. To switch sides with Tartaros. Together they could leave this filthy land, conquer others, including the abode of enemies with the help of their common strength. With these words, the demon again extended his hand to Jeffir. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the heavy breathing of the man. He let out a long breath, looking down, and asked if Tartaros would really accept him into their ranks. The demon chuckled, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, once again confirming his intention. Jeffir licked the blood from his cracked lip and smiled, saying that it sounded good, but it flashed through his mind that this was complete nonsense. The guy was mortally wounded in this battle. The insidious demon could not help but know that the man could no longer be saved, but still offers to conquer something together, saying that he will give a chance. Isn't this a trick of a heartless monster who just wants to see a desperate young man beg him like a coward? And how can Jeffir beg his enemy who took away his friends and loved ones? With these thoughts, the guy extended his trembling hand to the other man's palm, as if he was ready to do anything for the sake of his life. With each slowly dragging second, the disgusting grin on Tartaros's face grew wider. A female silhouette appeared in front of Jeffir's face. Someone complained about the guy's nasty character, but the woman asked not to swear, because that's what he would have done. The warrior smiled, however. He never listens to anyone, so he will just do one funny spell. His hand stopped shaking and instantly covered the remaining distance to the demon's palm, clinging to it with a death grip. Tartaros, not expecting such a sharp maneuver from the weakened man, stepped back in amazement. Swallowing the blood that was rising to his lips, the guy said that if he did it with his own hand, the force that was beyond his capabilities would simply tear the human body apart. The handshake was illuminated with blue light. Jeffir stared angrily at the devil Tartaros. This was his answer to the offer. With his other hand, the young man showed the monster the middle finger and loudly sent him to hell. A long journey that drunken workers in the city tavern sent each other on in times of peace. If Jafir had found the strength to laugh, he would have been laughing at Tartaros's defenseless, childlike face, staring in surprise at his and the man's palms, from which an incredibly bright light was now emanating. The warrior could only stretch his lips into a caustic smile, while tears flowed from his eyes due to the glow. The demon's body burned brighter than ever, like the largest and most solemn funeral pyre. And then it flared up and exploded. The fire became so large that it stretched for kilometers, and the charred silhouette of Tartaros, which could not move from one place. The monster opened its yellow eyes in shock, looking ahead. Covered in soot, he saw how his hand, which had recently been clutching someone else's palm, became charred and separated from his body. He still stood motionless, his mouth slightly open. The fangs clicked loudly. The eyes became even wider. Only one thought swarmed in the head. What happened to the hand? Time sped up again as Tartaros realized what had happened, his face twisting into a grimace of incredible anger. There was a deafening cry from the demon who had been so insidiously deceived by man. He sank helplessly onto the hot ground, unable to do anything. Tartaros was burned and charred, leaving only thin membranous threads from his once majestic wings. With all the curses known to the monster, he cursed this rotten little man Jafir, who dared to deceive his. Let this freak's mother give birth to him again. With a furious cry, Tartaros swung his fist and slammed it into the stone block with all his might. The blow was decisive, and the demon's charred body crumbled into many pieces. This is how the battle of the last man ended, who could not avenge the people dear to him. He burned, unable to protect everyone as he promised. Everything ended in a shameful defeat, and everything should have been exactly like this. But the fading consciousness returned to the deceased again. Jafir was able to feel his own finger movement. He opened his eyes sharply and cried out in surprise, finding himself whole, lying on a cold floor in some bright space. Thoughts raced through his head about how this could have happened to him, the one who had burned alive in that nightmarish battle. Jafir sat up and began to feel himself, noticing distantly that even the armor is intact, and on his body he did not feel a single wound that he received in the fight with the demons. The warrior had no idea where he was, and there was no one to ask. He sat all alone in a beautiful, majestic hall with high ceilings, huge columns, and 3 statues. The figures depicted gods. Did this mean that the guy ended up in some kind of temple? Was there such a building nearby? My gaze fell on the inscription that was located under the central statue. Jafir narrowed his eyes, reading the symbols carved into the stone several times. He smiled wryly when he finally managed to let what he had read into his confused thoughts clearly: the afterlife. Suddenly, a strange voice rang out in his head, which objected to him. This is not the afterlife, but the lower level of the pantheon, the abode of the gods. In the opening opposite the warrior, from which a bright blue light emanated, a large cloud of energy appeared, resembling a portal. From there, a fair-haired woman in white robes fluttered out, her huge snow-white wings behind her back losing several feathers, which softly landed on the stone floor. She opened her eyes, and framed by completely white eyelashes, the woman's gaze was as innocent as that of a newborn child. Jafir remembered the main rule: do not trust anyone, and immediately instinctively reached behind his back with his right hand to grab his sword. But everything did not go according to plan. He realized with concern that the weapon was not being summoned. The palm grabbed onto emptiness. The man had nothing to defend himself with in case of an attack. The woman, flapping her 2 pairs of wings for the last time, told Jafir that he had nothing to be surprised about. She, the eldest angel Mercedes, had come to convey to him the will of the gods. The warrior is dead, and following the procedure, the angel is obliged to send him straight to the underworld. But everything was not so simple. Due to persistent requests from several gods, the 3 supreme gods decided to send Jafir into the past. The warrior's thick white eyebrows drew together as he asked Mercedes what this meant. The woman explained that he would be sent back in time with all his memories, meaning that the boy had a chance to change the outcome of the battle. And although he will return to the past along with his memories, Jafir will not have all of his acquired skills, magic, and endurance. Mercedes' face was expressionless as she added dispassionately that the young man had once already become the one who had climbed to the top of the human pyramid. Jafir narrowed his eyes warily when he heard that it wouldn't be difficult for him to restore everything again. He still couldn't figure out if he was in a dream, since Tartaros, as far as he knew, didn't have the art of illusion, or if this was just death euphoria. The guy exhaled heavily, placing his hands on his hips, thinking about what the angel had said. Straightening up, Jafir asked why they decided to give him such a chance. Mercedes raised her hand, agreeing that it was hard to believe, but she could provide evidence that would help. The guy waved his hand, interrupting the angel. Let's say he would believe. but he just had no idea yet what he should do. After all, in the world you always have to pay for everything. It turns out that the gods need something, so he is given such a unique chance. When demons were killing people by the thousands, people prayed with all their hearts. The gods cut off contact with the world, did not answer prayers, and did not accept offerings. Moreover, they took away the powers of the priests, who could fight by borrowing the power of the gods. Thus, the human army, having lost its defensive and healing skills, was instantly defeated. Jeffrey wasn't going to believe the angel's sweet words, because the gods abandoned the human race as soon as they realized that they would not get anything more on Earth. Such calculating freaks can't just give a chance. As if having overheard the man's thoughts, the angel obediently lowered her eyes, saying that she would convey to him the will of the gods. Blue Eyes looked straight at the guy, suddenly flashing dangerously. From Mercedes' body came a roar, forming the speech of many gods. They demanded more bread and circuses from man. Upon hearing this, Jafir's face darkened in rage. How dare those bastards? The young man's eyes fixed on the woman's figure, and he asked again, hoping that he had imagined it. Mercedes easily reported that the gods who had turned their attention to the guy felt sorry for his life, because it was rare to meet a person who would go so firmly to the end when only death lay ahead of him. The veins on Jeffrey's temples bulged with anger as soon as he heard how the battle with numerous monsters, which he had been waging for 5 long years, seemed very interesting to the gods. Many gods would be upset if everything ended too quickly, so they watched the man. He should remember that closer to the end, he was lucky more and more often. Mercedes barely had time to report that the gods were helping the warrior until he paid for something, when a bright stream of light flew at the angel. She silently took a step to the side, dodging the attack of the maddened Jafir. The columns in the hall collapsed from his furious force. The warrior cursed filthily at the angel. Well, it turns out the gods were having fun? The guy lost his dearly loved ones in that battle, and he still feels their touch on his skin. They fought so desperately with the monsters because they wanted one thing: to live. And now the gods are telling us that they found it interesting and fun? Jafir screamed furiously, clenching his fist to summon another round of magic spells. Did the gods really think he was fighting to amuse them? Was this really a puppet show? Mercedes, with an unreadable look, held out her palm with a divine spell, pointing it at the guy. The tangible figure of the spell rose up, and from there appeared the foot of a giant, chained in golden chains. Jafir felt an inhuman force pressing down on him, pulling him towards the floor. He couldn't stand it for even a second before his knees buckled under the weight. The giant moved his foot and crushed Jafir like a disobedient bug. Mercedes extended her hand again, slightly lifting her foot off the ground. And with this, the destroyed slabs moved apart. Coming closer to the kneeling boy, she quietly asked him to be polite, because the gods were watching them. Mercedes leaned toward Jafir, resting her hands on her knees, and told the warrior, who was shaking with tension, that it seemed he had not understood her thought. When the gods said, "interesting," they meant only one guy, and were not at all interested in humans as a race. Angel lifted Jeffrey's chin, and he bared his teeth in disgust. A strange light of madness lit up her eyes, which frightened the warrior for a moment. But Mercedes said that if he proved his worth, he would get what he wanted. It could be something for him personally, or for all people. It didn't matter. The young man understood that he had no way out, not a single option to change his fate, and in impotent anger he froze under the weight of the giant. After all, as the angel said, you always have to pay for everything. The woman wanted to add something else, and snapped her fingers. The giant's leg disappeared, allowing the man to breathe deeply again. It turns out that among all of them, there was a god who persistently asked to return the guy to the past for another reason. Jafir raised his head sharply, vaguely guessing whose hated name he was about to hear. In the pantheon, walls exploded and furniture flew from Tartaros's devilish fury. While one of his hands was bandaged, the second demon threw pieces of columns at the workers who processed divine requests. So much did Tartaros not want to wait for a chance to deal with a man. Everything around him was burning with his anger. The demon who had acquired more than 10 worlds was knocked out because of some youngster. Enough jokes. He urgently needed to make sure that all this did not happen. Jafir dropped his hands helplessly, sitting on the stone, and looked at this depressing picture, because the angel showed in the magic mirror what the demon was doing. The devil Tartaros, the god of destruction who destroyed 10 worlds, his goal is to destroy all worlds. Up until this point, he has never lost. He is a warrior who has never been injured. Mercedes, as if with some kind of reproach, turned to the guy, saying that he had ruined his service record. He had hurt his pride so much. Jafir cursed under his breath. Was it really for this reason that this crazy bastard was destroying the pantheon right now? It turns out that the devil wants to fight man again in order to achieve a clear victory. The angel, humbly folding her palms in front of her, looked slyly at the guy, asking what his thoughts were on this matter. The corner of Jeffer's lips twitched and a laugh escaped his mouth. The warrior clenched his fist, the leather of his gloves creaking in the silence of the room. It was such an obvious question. Standing on his feet, Jafir smiled openly. Since the devil wanted to die, he would have to fulfill his request. Mercedes began the ritual, placing the man in a charmed circle. She said that the point of arrival would be random. Jeffer would have enough time to restore his strength. In addition, the gods wanted to give him a gift. The young man would be able to check it immediately upon arrival. Looking somewhere ahead, Jafir thought, even though these gods are disgusting, there is still a chance, and he can use it to take revenge not only on Tartaros, but on all the gods who abandoned humanity. And so, the location has been chosen. Confirmation of the constellation, for space-time movement, confirmation received. Still emotionless, Mercedes glanced at Jafir and wished him luck, expressing the hope that he would find it interesting. She recited a prayer, and the rune circle multiplied, shone brightly in space and quickly began to spin. Jafir gradually disappeared in this glow. At first there was emptiness. A little later the guy began to hear voices, and then, opening his eyes, he saw male silhouettes. Jafir blinked, and the next moment he saw several shirtless men more clearly. They cursed foully, frightened that the guy was not breathing. And again the saving darkness. But someone began to persistently call him newbie, shake him, and demand that he wake up. Jeffer suddenly opened his eyes. Water poured onto my head and my wet hair again blocked my entire view. Finally, Jeffer woke up, finding himself in a cave, surrounded by men with strange tattoos on their shoulders. The one who poured water on him seemed to be glad that he woke up, assuring his comrades that he did not kill the guy who had just woken up. Decorated. The scarred face looked at the former warrior with a silly smile, splashing the last drops of water from the windskin. He looked around at those present, long-forgotten images floating from his memory, reminding him of the distinctly familiar faces of the guys who were looking at him with barely concealed malice and wide, evil smiles. My gaze stopped on a strange tattoo on the chest of the guy opposite. A cross, circled exactly in the middle. That was that very brand. Finally, he remembered, and covering his face with his hand, he coughed loudly, bursting into laughter, causing the men to be perplexed. Why did he go back exactly 10 years to his 20 years? His comrades kept their mocking glances at the guy. One of them had a pickaxe in his hands. Jeffer returned to the time when he served in the temple as a slave. A man appeared not far from them, shining a lantern on the way. He was the leader of the group, and rudely asked what was going on, then ordered them to end their rest and return to their workplaces. Jeffer was still sitting on the cold ground when, apparently, the leader of the group of men cast a frontal glance at him, cursed, and threatened to kill him if he interfered again. The former warrior fearlessly turned his head, asking again what his comrade had blurted out. The man, who had managed to move away, was about to pounce on the blonde again with his fists, but his friends pulled him away, while Jafir indifferently rubbed his face with his hands. He didn't even want to worry about such scum. He looked around in surprise when he heard a thin, childish groan nearby. The child weakly thanked the guy for standing up for him, but he had absolutely no memory of how exactly Jafir had helped this child. Shrugging, the former warrior grabbed the free pickaxe and trudged further down the tunnel, not saying anything to the small stranger, leaving him sitting on the floor, confused. It would take the boy a while to adjust. It was harder to walk in old, torn boots than in his usual armor. After taking a few steps, the young man suddenly remembered another of Mercedes's words. She had promised him a gift from the gods. An image of an angel appeared before my eyes, who said that the gift could be used if I said the phrase, "Open a special advantage." Jeffer hid behind a large rock, waiting until the child, heavily dragging a pickaxe behind him, went further into the tunnel to the others. After waiting a few more seconds, Jeffer, trying to speak as quietly as possible, said the necessary words. A bright yellow glow appeared where he stood, engulfing his body like a snake. Realizing what was about to happen, the former warrior straightened up abruptly. He certainly didn't expect this. A sly smile played on the guy's lips, anticipating something unusual. Crazy. His gaze resembled the expression on the face of a gold prospector. Here it is, the treasure that belongs only to him. When the former warrior got to work, the other slaves were so amazed by his skills that they even stopped digging the rock. They talked to each other, discussing the newcomer. Maybe he was a miner? The speed of the boy's work was especially noted. The pick in his strong hands rose and fell so quickly that sometimes it was impossible to discern the sequence of movements. After some time, several bags were filled to the brim with black pieces of coal. Those same men, having seen enough, went to another part of the tunnel, one dreaming that Jeffir was in their team, the second swearing that now they would have to work just as painstakingly. But the guy was busy working hard and was occupied with completely different thoughts. He still could believe that you received it for free in such circumstances. In his mind, he kept returning to those happy moments when he discovered the special advantage. After the main phrase, Jeffir's head split from pain, he grabbed his forehead, realizing that all the information instantly appeared in his mind. The guy's eyes widened in shock. This was something different, unlike anything he had ever seen before. This was the repository of all the best skills. The lightsaber skill, the iron wall, rebirth, and that was only a small part, including those he didn't have before. Jeffir even laughed nervously. How could these stingy gods just give him such treasures? The guy was brought out of his thoughts by the menacing cry of the same worker who had been shouting at the workers at the beginning. He noticed that the slave was standing by the wall of the tunnel, staring at one point. The man angrily walked towards the former warrior, shouting that he had ordered everyone to return to work. He was a head shorter than Jeffir, and yet, feeling himself unpunished, he threatened the blonde with lashes on his first day of work. The whip itself he was clutching in his hand. The warrior turned his head, recognizing the person shouting. It was the head of the mining brigade. He grabbed hold of whip, cursing at the slaves, calling them stupid bastards who never understand in a good way. The man, with a bestial expression on his face, swung the whip with all his might, shouting that he would now teach the boy to listen. A loud whistle was heard, but the weapon did not fall on the slave's body. He caught the end of the whip with his bare hands, without moving from the spot. The boss froze in place, raising his head. He peered into the worker's face, amazed that the guy was able to catch the whip with his hand. To his great surprise, the worker extended the end to him, bowing respectfully and asking for forgiveness, promising to return to work immediately. While the boss, like a big fish, opened and closed his mouth, Jeffir left him and went to his workplace, silently examining his palm. Thanks to his past combat experience, the young man saw every tiny movement. Guns, but there wasn't a scratch left on him. The palm with which he had grabbed the whip was unharmed, only the bandages wrapped around his hand, torn. Special ability number 1, the skill Iron Wall, significantly increases defensive skills, completely absorbs damage below the owner's own defense level, guarantees high endurance. Jeffir realized with satisfaction that he didn't feel tired at all. He could have worked like that all day long. The pickaxe clanged as it hit the hard rock. Although the conditions were bad if used correctly, this skill was very useful. The boy thought while working that he had received only 9 special abilities, and if he also took into account his knowledge of the future, he would be able to quickly regain his strength. With these thoughts, he threw sacks filled to the brim with coal in front of the man keeping records. Jeffir continued to add more and more bags to this pile. Considering that there were more than 10 of them, the man stuttered as he praised the boy for a job well done. At the end of the working day, all the slaves gathered in the square, where the boss announced their rating. In first place was the F team, which included Jeffir. Hearing a delighted squeak next to him, he realized that he was in the same team as the baby. Team B came in second place, and their offenders looked askance at the winners, wondering how they had managed to take first place. The third place was taken by the Team H. Its members began to dance with happiness, but the remaining Team E, which took the last place, was not so lucky. Its members burst into tears, falling to their knees. The boss explained that, according to the rules of the mine, the money and products of the last team are distributed among the first, second, and third places. Jeffir glanced at the group of unfortunates whose property would soon be distributed to strangers. The chief ordered to pray to the great goddess Arya, and all the slaves present instantly fell to their knees, raising their hands to the heavens, and began to praise the goddess, asking her for salvation with their eternal light. Jeffir, watching this mass madness, continued to stand calmly, mentally blaspheming in the most indecent forms. On the continent, among the 3 great deities, the goddess of light Arya, who was depicted as a beautiful warrior clad from head to toe in armor, was the most worshipped, and she was also the greatest creditor. Almost everyone who lived here had lost their home because of the monsters, so all the slaves, groaning from the weight of the day spent in the mines, dreamed of getting to bed as soon as possible. Or, like Jeffir, they were adventurers. But after the temple saved them from death, they ended up in slavery to pay off a huge debt for treatment. It all came down to the fact that while a person has a stigma slave, he will not be able to move freely, because if you go beyond the limits without permission, the person's heart will quickly stop. Jeffir knew that he needed to pay off what he owed as soon as possible and regain his freedom. Tartaros wouldn't get off so easily this time. The guy, wandering wherever his eyes looked, clenched his teeth in anger, remembering the devil. He would take revenge, no matter what. Before my eyes flashed the touch of thin hands, so familiar to the point of pain, so familiar to the point of mental anguish. How the beautiful face moves away from him, begging for help, unable to reach. Finally, having resigned herself, the beautiful eyes opposite fill with tears and a gentle smile freezes on the lips. Jeffir, his eyes clouded by his own tears, extended his hand in response as if in a fog. It becomes so painful and heavy in her chest that she has to cover it with her palm, so that her heart doesn't burst out. His Alteo, he will be able to protect her. His legs brought Jeffir to the square. At the entrance stood a church worker in a long white and gold robe. She pointed somewhere in the direction where one could visit a store or confess. There, the townspeople and slaves gathered to drink beer and eat baked potatoes after the grueling work. The former warrior glanced at the local prices. A mug of beer cost 80 silver coins. Looking into one of the shops where the locals eagerly bought mugs of beer and sausages, Jeffir thought that he hadn't seen such idiotic prices for a long time. He was brought out of his reverie by the same familiar childish voice. The child from the mine was offering to treat Uncle Jeffir to some beer. He looked back and asked rather rudely if his colleague had a lot of money. There were several silver coins in the little hand. The baby squeaked that he had just received the coins, although he wouldn't be able to buy anything expensive. The child pressed the coins to his chest, reminding him that Jeffir had protected him in the mine, and that thanks to him, their team had taken first place. The boy looked down, smiled, and added that the team was made up of weaklings, and they usually took the last places, so you could say that this was the first time he had received money. Jeffir looked at the boy carefully, his head bowed, and immediately understood why he was being beaten like that. After all, if at least one miner from the group falls ill and cannot work, then the efficiency of the entire team drops sharply. Having sabotaged at least one team in this way, the team in which the offender is a member automatically rises to a higher position. Jeffir turned around and waved his hand dismissively, replying that he would not eat the child. The boy muttered something in response, but the guy thought that he was doing this on purpose to make him feel sorry for him. Let him not bother him with all sorts of nonsense. He would only get on his nerves. The former warrior approached another shop, where a friendly salesman was polishing beer glasses, greeting a potential customer. Without responding to the greeting, Jeffir asked if the shop sold a restorative potion, causing the man to become slightly confused. Scratching his bald head under his kerchief, his expression immediately changed, asking the newcomer if he had any money. 1 gold coin for a glass, 4 for a bottle. But if the slave doesn't howl in pain, then it would be better for him to endure it. Without answering, the guy poured several coins onto the counter. 1.5 gold coins. Smiling, Jeffir said that he would borrow the rest and ask the seller for a receipt, which he was going to sign. His words shocked the boy standing behind him. He, sweating and stuttering, tried to call his uncle to reason. Seeing how the seller quickly put his stamp on the receipt with Jeffir's signature, the child rightly asked if he had gone crazy. While the young man emptied another bottle of potion, the kid screamed and explained to Jeffir what would happen if he couldn't pay his debts. He had no stable income, he couldn't go into the red, and the interest on the additional loan was terribly high. Throwing his head back for another sip, the blonde glanced sideways at the boy, assuring him that he would also pay off the ill-fated interest. Recovery is a popular product that restores stamina. If you drink a large amount of it, you can get a hidden effect, an increase in magical energy, and the former warrior knew about it. But even after drinking 10 bottles, the effectiveness remains low. But not in the case when a person has a special ability, the skill, Secret of Hermes. It improves the effectiveness of any potions. Jeffir understood that he would not earn much money in the mine. Even if he worked as hard as he could, he should not expect a good reward. The last empty bottle is Loudrang when the guy dropped her into the pile with the others. The potion really helped. With each workout, the guy improved his physical strength. There was a need to find a way out of this situation in an unconventional way. So the blonde man came to the mine manager and reported that he had heard a howl in the mine itself. He received this news with alarm, and then Jeffir asked him to inform the hunters about it so that he could lead them to the place where he heard the sounds. The answer to the question, what to do, was, money can be earned in the dungeon. Monsters are creatures generated by the magical flow. Many of them are aggressive and pose a great threat to people. And although these creatures suffered great damage during all the years of war, their appearance became a help for humanity. Magic crystals and stones inside the monsters' bodies, as well as skin and bones, served as excellent material for creating weapons and armor. As a result, monsters quickly came to be seen as a valuable resource. Each cave in which these reptiles lived concealed both great danger and great profit. After some time, guests actually arrived to see the mine manager. 3 of the best monster hunters, tall young men in armor and long robes, walked along the ground, carrying heavy weapons in their hands. Hunters are slaves with martial skills, selected specifically to deal with monster problems. The price for their work is as high as the risk of the hunt, and the success of the mission often predicts an additional fee. Folding his arms across his chest, Jafir thought resentfully about why an adventurer like him had been assigned to the miners. When he went to the bank where he usually took out a loan for the potion, he was rudely refused a loan. When asked whether the daily limit had been exceeded, the man lamented that Jafir's rank was too low and he would not receive another penny. When the blond man was thinking about whether he should take money from someone, a church worker, who had heard the entire conversation well, ran up to him. She, smiling sweetly, offered the guy to open a line of credit if he sold his internal organs, since the temple buys these organs for scientific research. The girl had all the documents with her, which Jafir began to study carefully. The operation would be scheduled for the next week. If he returned the proceeds, he would be able to cancel the operation. The creditor twirled his finger at his temple when he watched these two. Having handed the man a paper, Jafir ordered that all the money be spent on bringing the restorer. The seller, carrying boxes of bottles, maliciously muttered that he didn't care about the madman's future fate. With her hands folded in a prayerful gesture, the church worker sighed in admiration, almost calling the guy crazy, but came to her senses in time, calling him a real man. When the last empty bottle fell to the floor with a clang, the girl was amazed yelped. She had never seen so many containers of restorative in her life. The blonde smiled with satisfaction, feeling with his whole being that he was truly ready. The sound of a spear tip hitting the asphalt was heard next to him. Straightening up, Jaffer saw a hunter greeting him, who asked if he was the guy who would accompany them. The blonde smiled and nodded, glad that the hunters had arrived just in time. The guy, the head of the reconnaissance group, introduced himself. His name was Goth, and the other 2 were Dale and Marco. Jeffer shook the outstretched hand, saying that he had no night vision skills, but he could use a magical pulse, and he also expressed hope that their small team would work well together. Night vision is a skill that allows you to see in complete darkness. The magical pulse sharpens perception due to the released energy. These skills are necessary if a person wants to penetrate the lair of monsters unnoticed. Goth adjusted his helmet, thought that the price for the night vision potion was high, and then suggested out loud that they move out if everyone was ready. Goth and Dale went forward, the latter not missing the chance to laugh at the miner who uses a magical pulse. Marco, with a sledgehammer over his shoulder, roughly ordered Jeffer to take the luggage. The blonde listened indifferently to how Dale couldn't calm down, mocking the slave, who apparently thought he was going to crush the lair with them, but God immediately asked him to shut up. This didn't bother Jafir. Later, everything would fall into place, especially since he doesn't know 2 of them, but he's definitely familiar with one. He was transferred to the hunters a month after the cave was cleared out, and 2 people died under its arches that time. The guy smiled. It seemed like he had figured out how he could use these guys. Goth, breathing heavily, stepped onto the last stone of the forest staircase. He exhaled heavily, leaning on a long spear behind the man. Following, the rest of the hunters and Jeffer followed. At the entrance to the cave, they were met by several figures in cloaks with deep hoods. One of them, with a mask on his face and glasses flashing, called himself a support group and asked everyone to stretch their hands forward. The man began to tie a special rope around the wrist of each participant in the expedition. Even Jeffer, who was puzzled by such care, got such a rope. The man showed his wrist, which had 4 of the same magic bracelets. If something happens to the hunters, the bracelets on his hand will break, and the support group will be able to immediately request help from the main headquarters. When the hunters entered the cave with the blonde man, the man shouted out his hope that he wouldn't have to call anyone, so let them concentrate and do their job cleanly. As an escort, Jeffer went ahead of the entire group of hunters. No one objected, and everyone continued walking in complete silence. The footsteps of people echoed loudly in the silence of the long tunnel of the cave. After some time, a flashing light appeared at the end of the tunnel, and the shadows on the walls began to dance. Someone's paw, scratching the stones on the ground with long claws, took a step forward. 2 monsters with human habits walked along the passage, holding torches and long daggers in their paws, and they themselves were dressed in torn loincloths. One of them, with its mouth open, stared at the wall, into which a pebble had flown from somewhere on the side. Both monsters stared at the lying stone, turning their heads like animals and baring their teeth. Hunters immediately appeared behind their backs like shadows. Goth immediately jumped up to one of the monsters, grabbed it by the mouth and ran his sword across its throat. The main task of the reconnaissance group is to detect monsters and collect information about the lair. Dale dealt with the second monster, plunging his sword into its head. Then, smiling, sheathing his weapon, he examined the corpses of the creatures. Based on the collected data, a cleanup group is formed which cuts out all the evil spirits. This is the standard sequence of such missions. Jafir pointed in the right direction and was the first to climb into the narrow space of the cave, seeing a small recess there in which he could rest. The hunters assumed that the monsters they encountered were those that survived the last time. God said there was another lair on the other side of the mine entrance. Teams A and B had cleared it out last week. Dale assumed the surviving monsters had dug a tunnel and were hiding in it. As expected, the reconnaissance team had good skills, so an inspired Goth began drawing a diagram in the sand with a dagger. Turning to Dale and Marco, raising his visor, he smiled, offering to deal with the monsters themselves. If the scouts decided that they could handle the cleanup on their own, they would enter the battle without orders. The guys' mouths opened in surprise. They didn't expect everything to happen so quickly. Frowning, Dale told the commander that they could just scout out the situation and not put themselves in danger. He continued that it was too risky. What if there was a whole group of monsters lurking there, and there were only 3 of them? Got corrected him. There were 4 of them. All that was needed was to grab the kobold. Dale nervously pointed his finger at Jafir, exclaiming that the commander must be joking. Were they really going to fight this porter? Marco patted him on the shoulder, urging him to calm down, then turned to the commander, suggesting that they first listen to his plan and only then decide something. Goth glanced at the other hunters with a sly look and smiled. He turned to Jafir, asking him to get something from his bag, and he nodded, fulfilling the request. When the porter took out several branches with red berries and placed them on the ground, the hunter explained that these were the fruits and leaves of the actinidia. Dale covered his face with his hand and gagged as the blond man began to crush the berries in a wooden bowl with a mortar. In this case, you can get the smell of cobalt females during the period of estrus. The smell, according to Goth, is quite strong. The creatures can smell it from more than 100 meters away. Indeed, at the other end of the cave, the cobalt stopped and began to sniff carefully, forgetting about everything else in the world. As the foul smell filled his nostrils, thick saliva flowed from the monster's mouth, and he licked his lips carnivorously. Goth, smiling slyly, covered his mouth with his hand and waved a bowl of crushed berries through the air, spreading the aroma. A kobold, maddened with lust, was rushing towards them from the tunnel at full speed. Finally, approaching, he howled in surprise when his limbs touched not solid ground, but small branches. Thus, a group of hunters managed to trick the beast into a trap. Kobold barked, like an offended dog, and fell into a deep hole. There he said goodbye to life, because the bottom was covered with thick and sharp wooden stakes, on which the rest of the monster's brothers had already been impaled. Goth smiled triumphantly at his comrades because he said that everything would work out. They praised the commander's decision. The man beamed with self-satisfaction, and when asked when he had prepared this, he replied that it was all life experience. Jafir watched him silently, since it was he who had advised the hunter. In his past life, after the boy was transferred to the hunters, he was on the same team with Goth. He sought recognition from other hunters, but he never got the chance, until he met a former warrior. Goth froze with wineskin water in his hands, asking Jafir in surprise if the road to the cave was clear. Even before the commander had carried out his supposed plan, the porter called him over to tell him something. The blonde admitted that he had already gone down to the place where the monsters were supposed to be, and there was a small lair of surviving kobolds. The hunter was surprised, asking if the ordinary miner was too self-confident, but he replied that before coming here, he was responsible for reconnaissance in his team, Skate Jafira, to look for secret paths. Got scratched his chin thinking, if the newbie says that they can handle it just the 4 of them, then we can try to follow his plan? The blonde replied that the decision would be up to the commander, but he thought it was definitely worth a try. Got, turning his back to the guy, smiled easily. This place could bring them good money. It would be a pity to share with others. The hunter thought that this Jafir was not as useless as he seemed. Incidentally, actinidia is not easy to find, but their carrier is well-trained and seems to be well acquainted with monster hunting. The hunter's smile widened as he realized how much pleasure he was getting from knowing he was superior. Since Jafir had left the decision to his superior, the man decided that, as a commander, he would put in a good word for the guy and he would quickly be transferred to the hunters. Calling the blonde to him, Goth handed him a dagger. He thanked him, clutching the weapon tightly in his hands. Goth winked at the guy, deciding that everything the newbie did, he did on purpose to look better in front of him. However, what difference does it make? In any case, his aspiration is commendable, and the hunter did not consider himself a complete scum. He should not worry about some lair of kobolds. Having thrust his spear into the monster's neck, he was determined to take from this cave everything it could give. Sharply pulling the tip out of the kobold's flesh, Goth loudly announced that they had dealt with most of the creatures. Marco, deftly handling the kobolds with his hammer, was openly having fun. He didn't think it would be so easy and fun. His boss was looking at a small blue stone. It was a pity that there were so few of them. Jafir had just emerged from a narrow passage he had been examining for monsters and reported that it was clear. Goth wanted to give another order, when suddenly Dale's voice was heard in one of the still unexplored passages, right at the entrance. He noticed something. The guy crouched down to get a better look at the find. A pile of small bones. Or maybe they were just remains. Grabbing the remains of someone's paw with his fingertips, he couldn't understand what it was. And it didn't look like a wild animal. Just as he realized that these were cobalt bones, two burning red lights appeared from the depths of the cave. Then a huge clawed paw, like someone's deadly weapon, protruded from the passage. Apparently, a monster of considerable size had been hiding for a long time and immediately grabbed the man, holding him in its claws. He was so shocked that he didn't even try to free himself, while the monster's hand forced its way through, widening the passage with its own body. Goth desperately shouted his partner's name, realizing that he couldn't help him in any way. But the monster apparently changed its mind about killing and threw the man away from itself, trying to get out. Dale, like a rag doll, instantly flew in the opposite direction. He let out a strangled wheeze as he slammed into the hard wall of the cave with all his might. Marco screamed at the top of his lungs. The hammer in his hands heated up and began to glow red. A round symbol appeared on the handle, and the man ran forward, ordering the others to take cover behind him. He grimaced at the realization of how wrong he had been. He thought that everything was over, so what was hidden there? The hunter quickly explained that the symbol on his weapon was a magical shield that would stop even the orc chieftain. This monster should not be able to break through the defense. Marco didn't expect at all that the monster's long, pointed tail would stick out from the passage and knock him off his feet along with his vaunted shield. The blow caused blood to gush from the man's mouth and he began to cough violently. How could it be that his shield couldn't withstand it? The bright blue tail continued to wriggle like a whip, striking the man with more blows. Goth looked at this in horror, shouting the name of his colleague. Stunned by the shock that had overwhelmed him, the hunter realized who the tail belonged to. Meanwhile, having finished with Marco, the monster's limbs switched to Goth. He looked at the approaching death with huge eyes, as if in slow motion. A new batch of hot human blood gushed onto the walls of the cave, and a loud and drawn-out cry of horror and pain was heard. Meanwhile, the support group at the entrance to the cave seemed to be going according to plan. But finally, the man in glasses noticed his wrist and swore in shock. His magic bracelets. If something happens to the group of hunters, they will break right on his arm. So why the hell did three of them break at once now? He turned around in horror, sweat pouring down his face under the mask. What was going on there? Meanwhile, the hunter's blood was flooding the ground in their shelter. The Goth, whose torn bracelet hung from his wrist and whose armor was in great disrepair, whimpered like a child. Clutching his wounded and bloody shoulder, he, covered in sweat and blood, barely found the strength to raise his head. In front of him, without a single scratch and without a gun, stood their porter, Jafir, in a fighting stance, covering the commander with his body. No one knew that he was using the Iron Wall skill. It increased defensive functions, completely absorbed damage below the owner's own defense level, and guaranteed high endurance. However, raising his hand and looking closely at his wrist, the guy realized that the monster had broken through his defense, even with the Iron Wall. Jeffrey's worried of myself, but he wasn't even a year old yet, so I thought it wouldn't be easy with this monster. The creature used the sharp tip of its tail to crawl towards Dale's unconscious body. The monster grabbed the bloody hunter tightly around the waist and lifted him off the ground. It is unclear whether the man died or whether there was still life within him, because not a sound came from his side. By this time, a huge monster with a strong body and a head with several pairs of eyes and huge teeth had completely cleared the passage to the hunter's haven. Jeffer watched him carefully without moving. It was the Predator, a creature that pretended to be the offspring of other monsters, using its pheromones to grow up and quickly eat its parents. Jafir turned sharply to Goth, asking only out of politeness to borrow his spear, grabbed the weapon. The man hysterically asked what he was going to do. The guy expertly twirled the spear in his hands. Then, straightening up to his full height, he straightened his arm, moving the gun to the side in front of the monster. His mouth immediately stretched into a sly smile. The blonde was about to warm up a little. He spoke softly to the monster, creating a small smoke symbol on his palm. He was going to grant it one last wish. A second later, a small ball could be seen in place of the smoke, and Jafir was already smiling openly, asking how exactly the predator wanted to die. It was her. Special ability number 3. But hitherto, it is unclear what exactly its characteristics are. A magical silhouette of a key, decorated with wings on top, appeared on Jafir's bandaged palm. It was a silver key. It opened the door to the Forgotten Castle. The user could at any time and in any place put and take out various kinds of objects stored in the silver room. At the moment, the key is in the left hand. The next moment, the guy carried 2 objects out of the room, which now rested on his palm. He immediately threw them right on the floor in front of the astonished Goth. It was an ordinary-looking rag and the herb Dragon's Heart, a natural tonic that has the effect of calming the state of mind. The former warrior unwound part of the bandage from his hand in order to attach the spear shaft to his hand. Then Jafir asked Goth to step back. He wrapped the end of the bandage tighter around his palm and the handle to make sure everything was secure. The guy took a deep breath and thrust his spear forward, declaring that now the fun part was about to begin. Goth stepped back, shocked, asking what he meant. Seeing the enraged predator rushing straight towards them, the hunter screamed, asking the boy what he was thinking, since he wasn't even a fighter. Having applied the rag thrown to him to the wound, Goth, gritting his teeth, thought that even if he had to die here, he would not hide like a cowardly dog behind the miner's back. He froze abruptly as the space around him seemed to explode and turn a dark bloody color. The monster opened its wide mouth and, flashing countless fangs, roared, leaning on its hind legs. The skill Fear paralyzes the enemy, covering him with fear. This is exactly the trap that Goth found himself in. He fell to the ground, trying to crawl as far away as possible. The hunter trembled like an autumn leaf and remembered the story that the elder had told him long ago. The small town perished in suffering. Houses burned, people and their property burned alive. Men with only pitchforks in their hands tried to protect their relatives, while they did not know where to run, because there was only fire around. Several years ago, a nearby village was attacked by an adult predator, who took the lives of little people with one blow of his tail. He grabbed their bodies in his huge paws, immediately eating their limbs, spraying blood everywhere. Villagers. They watched everything that was happening without even blinking their eyes, and all because their bodies were completely consumed by fear. People watched their loved ones die. Unable to even close their eyes, they could only cry silently. And there was nothing to be done. All that was left was to wait for one's turn to go to one's forefathers. How late got remembered this, frozen on the floor in a pool of his own comrade's blood. As tears streamed from his eyes, the hunter did not immediately realize that the scenario in his head was different from what he remembered. His vision was clouded with horror, and the man heard only sharp sounds, not understanding what he was looking at all. Finally, he began to discern the silhouettes of the miner's hands, who was skillfully wielding his own hunting spear. Jafir was right at the creature's mouth and fearlessly attacked it, trying to get into its very throat. When the monster got tired of dodging, he was probably planning to make the main attack. A disgusting screech filled the cave, cutting the ears. The blonde jumped back to buy time, then, gaining speed, crossed the space separating him and the predator in a few leaps. The dragon heart, which he managed to chew and spit out the chewed stalk right on the run, really gave the warrior that promised state of mind, freeing him from fear and worries about the predator. Moreover, the guy had a special ability number 2, the Secret of Hermes. It improves the effectiveness of any secret medicines by 500%. As he ran, Jafir thought that among his 9 special abilities, he only had 1 weapon, and in general, it took an incredible amount of mana. So now it was not even worth thinking about using it. The left hand darted through the air, summoning a bottle of green liquid from the silver room. Jafir poured the potent poison of the poisonous king Fade, Varial, onto the tip of the spear. He so inopportunely recalled their last conversation in the castle near the warm fireplace, when Jafir asked the man if he would really so easily reveal to him the recipe that he had been studying all his life. Fade, folding his arms across his chest, shook his head, replying that the world would soon end anyway. There was no point in hiding anything. They will all rot eventually anyway. It's better to use them together. The king added that he still wanted the warrior to be sure to take advantage of. If with the help of his poison there will be at least 1 less creature, then at least someone will be saved. Taking aim, the blonde ran up to the predator and pointed the poisoned tip of the spear at him. An image of Fade appeared before my eyes for a moment. His left side of his face a solid scar, making his crooked smile look even more creepy. He said that he could not wish for more. The spear sank into the skin between the monster's ribs, spraying green poison around. After spinning the weapon several times, Jafir, gritting his teeth, jerked it out of the predator, leaving a huge cut from which the monster's black blood began to spurt like a fountain. Throwing his ugly head back, he let out a heart-rending squeal, sticking out his long tongue. The monster screamed and growled, shaking its head and tail in incredible pain. Because the deadly poison virial, made from the most common herbs, gets into the blood vessels, spreads throughout the body and destroys internal organs. And of course, it causes hellish pain. After all, the poisonous king was quite the sadist. The traitor still couldn't die and was still trying to touch his offender with his tail. There were 3 minutes left before the poison spread throughout his body. The blonde needed to hold out until that time. Jafir kept raining down new blows on the monster, now with the tip, now with the other. No less sharp tip of the spear. But at some point, luck turned away from the guy, and the predator, dodging, waved his long, dodgy tail. From the sharp and precise blow, the warrior flew back to the wall, holding the weapon tightly in his hands. The monster stood at the other end of the cave on all fours, its back turned to the man from its own blow. Jafir let out a muffled cry as he hit the hard stone hard, nearly damaging his spine. His eyes immediately went dark, but as soon as the guy came to his senses, he froze in horror. With his mouth wide open, the predator ran towards him with all his might, intending to swallow him on the spot. But the blonde wasn't going to give up so easily. With a sly smile, he threw a whole bottle of that very poison into the monster's mouth. Jafir deftly jumped to the side, and the monster, not expecting such a maneuver, buried its muzzle right into the stone wall, biting off pieces from it. Having jumped back, the guy managed to look back. The predator was pulled back. A fountain of blood was gushing from the monster's throat. He roared again from the pain that tore through him, sticking out his tongue, trying to breathe in at least a little air. But Fade's poison was merciless. The blonde counted down the seconds until the predator's death. 2 minutes left, although no, already 1. To escape, he jumped across a small area of the cave. Jafir understood perfectly well that with his current skills, it would be difficult to evade this creature. Therefore, after 1 minute has passed, he either tries to survive until the predator dies, or he would have to gather all the strength he had into one decisive and final blow. The former warrior deftly dodged the slowly dying monster, whose tail continued to actively beat from side to side. The guy suddenly grabbed the tip of the monster's tail with both hands. The next moment, the predator, spraying blood and squealing, threw the man up into the air, still waving his long appendage. Clinging tightly to the creature, Jafir even began to pray to all the gods he knew. He only had to endure a little longer. Finally, he realized that the decisive moment had come, and he let go of his hands. As he fell, Jafir raised his spear over himself with the long tip pointing downwards. He chose the most opportune moment when he was hanging right above the monster's head, and now he was about to plunge the weapon right into its crown. Approaching the cherished point, the guy, not holding back his emotions, let out a warlike cry. A second passed, and the poisonous tip entered one of the predator's many pairs of eyes. The warrior noticed from a distance that it was entering the slimy flesh as if into butter. Now Jafir knew he had to hold on tighter than ever, because the creature roared and threw its head back, trying to throw off this bug that was causing it so much pain. The traitor shook his head so hard that Jafir ducked, letting go of the handle of his spear. It caught on a hanging stone and broke in half, the tip still remaining in the alien's eye. The guy caught the second sharp part and placed it comfortably in his hand. He ducked down again and thrust it into the predator's other eye, wishing him to choke. The next step was the dagger that Goth had kindly given him. Jafir quickly pulled it out of its sheath. Muttering that this was another gift for the monster, the guy took aim. The knife deftly sank into the third eye, smashed that, causing the scarlet liquid to splash out. The monster screamed in pain, the predator's entire body shaking in excruciating convulsions. Stones from the blows of the huge body fell from the walls and ceiling, almost blocking the passage into the cave. Jafir stubbornly held on with his hands as his body jumped in the air along with the monster. The man's nails dug into the vile flesh. The guy did everything to save himself. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer and slid off the head, hanging with his whole body, holding only onto the hilt of the sword which remained in the monster's eye. The blade slowly sank under his weight, sinking into the mess. Pulling himself up, Jafir deftly pulled out a dagger and struck the monster again. Returning 10 years ago, he lost everything that could have made him better than this monster. He had no strength or magical energy, so he had to prepare like this. restorative. He remembered its properties well, and the hidden effect of drinking a large amount, and the fact that even if you drink a dozen bottles, it will not have any effect. It is necessary to have the special ability Secret of Hermes. Jeffir did everything to gain the magic with which he could crush the predator's skull. The warrior raised his fist over the monster's head, and the man's entire body was illuminated with a soft blue light. He was able to use the magic power management technique. The fist touched the spear and sent out a special discharge, electricity fueled by magic. Such a blow with a bright flash and destructive power fell on the top of the predator's head. It pierced his entire body, all the way to the ground, destroying even the stone floor of the cave. After a few seconds, Goth, who was sitting on his knees, began to chuckle nervously. He remembered with insane pain how he wanted to put in a good word for the miner so that he would be transferred to the hunters. I thought that he was deliberately showing off in front of his superiors to appease them, how he considered himself the best, and that he shouldn't worry about some lair of kobolds. How is he? Screwed up. This guy, even without his help, will quickly gain recognition from other hunters and rise to the top. But now Jafir is a simple miner and cannot go down into the dungeon without permission. If he needed a ticket here, that ticket was Goth. Meanwhile, the warrior, without having received a single wound in the battle, approached the hunter, not taking his eyes off him. They needed to chat. Several miles away, in the forest illuminated by the midday sun, heavy, painful sighs could be heard. Several men lay on the ground, one dead, with a cleaver in his head, the second beaten to the point of blood. He still had the strength to sit up. A tall, strong man with a pointed mace on a chain in his hands was advancing on him. The man crawled away from him, denied his involvement in anything, said it was a misunderstanding. The big man, the church worker, grinned and began to twirl his mace, holding on to the chain, saying that they had entered the temple together. Behind him slowly walked figures in cloaks and with swords in their hands. Unhappy called someone by name, turned to Sahak, asking him to believe him. Tears began to flow from the man's eyes. He sobbed and begged, insisting that he was not worshipping the devil. The warrior standing behind the big guy with a cross on his forehead grinned terribly, his eyes flashing with madness, and immediately ordered the unfortunate man to be killed. The big man didn't need to be asked twice. It was obvious that he took incredible pleasure in killing, because with a bloodthirsty smile he brought his mace down hard on the victim's head. Finally, the devil worshippers were finished off. The bodies lay under the treetops hiding the crushed heads with their shadows. Suddenly, one of the dead men began to tremble strangely. His mouth began to move, and a beetle began to slowly crawl out from there, wriggling its entire body. A few seconds passed before the creature emerged. It turned out to be a long centipede with a red symbol on its small head. Before the insect had time to crawl away, the man in the cloak cut it with a magic sword, causing the centipede to explode in the air. The fighter pulled the sword aside. It was all ablaze with red fire. He, flashing a mad look and licking his dagger, hissed that the insect had already appeared, and he knew for sure that the dead man was a follower of the devil. In the beautifully furnished office, a chandelier sparkled brightly, the rays of the sun shimmering beautifully in its drop-shaped details. An authoritative voice at the table addressed Sahak, who was kneeling, asking if it was one of the seven. Was the probability of what was happening not too low? He had been promised to catch one worm, but in the end, 7 members of the group had been destroyed. The owner of the voice was confronted with parts of a centipede floating in a jar of liquid, and was told that the protest was so serious that they had even burned down the straw houses. Sahak, still kneeling, addressed Inquisitor Matthias, who was sitting at the table. Now that he had removed his hood, one could see wheat-colored hair and the same cross that was applied to slaves. He said that the Inquisitor had heard of their methods. It must be assumed that the rest of the group had already been converted to the faith. The yellow eyes flashed dangerously as the man informed them that there was only a month left until the raid, and if they did not destroy the heretics hiding in the temple soon, they would soon have to pay for them with their own lives. Matthias was silent, deep in thought. He was carefully examining the centipede floating in the jar. Finally, he spoke up, promising to shut up the group of hunters. But in return, the man wanted to see the exact result, and let only Sahak, the trusted person of the Inquisition, try to let them down. He bowed and bared his teeth, saying that he would do everything as ordered. Meanwhile, in the city's Human Resources Department, where Gott brought Jeffer, the girl, a worker in a white uniform, sat at the table and pointed with her hand at the necessary papers to the commander of the reconnaissance group, Mr. Gott. First, he needed to fill out an application to hire this person, in which case, it was necessary to state his name and purpose. The hunter replied that Jeffer was standing next to him, who had started working as a miner this week. The girl replied that she understood and asked to wait 1 second. A little later, she said, smiling sweetly, that if a hunter wants to hire a person from another department, then he becomes a member of his group. And if the mistakes of the hired person lead to a decrease in the effectiveness of the entire group, this can negatively affect the personal assessment in the HR department. When the worker asked God if he agreed to these conditions, the man smiled broadly and nodded. He agreed, absolutely. The man glanced sideways at Jafir. If this guy worked properly, he could take credit for all his achievements. Deep down, God was only pursuing his own benefit. He was incredibly happy that, no matter what, do what you do and come what may. The hunter could not even imagine that he would get such a chance. Just last night in the dungeon, the man was shocked by what he heard from the one who defeated the terrible monster. Opening his mouth, the hunter asked Jafir, who was calmly looking over the predator's corpse, if he was sure that he should pretend that nothing had happened, that he had not killed the monster. Goth was silent for a few seconds, digesting what he had heard, then asked the guy if he was going to take the monster's bodies. Jafir replied that he would leave only the predator and the kobolds, and the miner, casting a sly glance at the hunter, asked him to report that this place was only a lair of kobolds. Monster corpses, magic stones, and items obtained in dungeons are all inaccessible to the temple slaves. After all, everything that the slaves found became the property of the temple itself, and so it was and always will be. The only thing a slave from a group of hunters can have is a reward for cleaning up and bonuses depending on the value of the trophy. So Jafir, knocking his knuckles on the predator, said that he could make good money if he took this carcass to the broker. Got, still pressing the wound with a rag, exclaimed that this was impossible. Didn't the guy know that just for such cases a support group was waiting outside, with whom the hunters had already spoken, and special people would come here to take the trophies? Jafir smiled and replied that he knew about it. This? But what's the difference? He placed his left palm, the back of which still bore the drawing of the key, on the predator's corpse. Streams of white-blue light burst out from the palm. The magic of the key took effect to take the item into the silver room. There was a product, but now it's gone. With these words, the huge carcass evaporated from the cave, as if it had never been there. The hunter couldn't believe his eyes. He saw with his own eyes how expanded the subspace, which is usually clogged with a couple of things, could be. And then this. Such a big creature disappeared and not even a trace of blood remained. When the silence that had returned dragged on, Jafir spoke the name of the senior hunter. Clenching his left hand into a fist, erasing the remnants of magic, the guy turned his head to the man sitting on the floor and asked if he wanted a promotion. As their small team sat outside the HR department door, Gott leaned his elbows on his knees, swaying slightly from side to side, and thought hard. There were 3 more dungeons to get to. The reward for clearing them could be split between the group members, and here you can take the corpses of monsters for yourself. Clearing dungeons every quarter and the total number of battles can greatly increase the chance of promotion, even if the dungeons are ordinary cobalt lairs. And since his group is a reconnaissance group, the hunters had a lot of battles. Few got stuck in one place for 3 years. The man imagined a bright future. If a skilled hunter joined the group, they would enter the dungeon first and take everything inside without outside interference. Being a small group, they would destroy several dungeons and Goth's reputation as a commander would greatly increase. The man thoughtfully propped his chin up with his fingers clasped together, thinking that he needed a promotion, and Jafir needed money. And this was a great deal. He just needed to hide it poorly, that's all. Jafir was also silent, his arms folded across his chest. He was also lost in his thoughts. He decided that he would be able to cover all his debts when he sold the predator at a good price and, to be honest, he would like to leave the temple as soon as possible. But he still had some business here. The warrior remembered well that in about a month there would be a large-scale raid by the temple knights, during which they would find an item that would shake the entire continent. Jafir needs to get into the raid team by any means necessary and get his hands on that item in order to change the future. Finally, the HR employee announced that Jafir was registered, and from that moment on he belonged to the group of hunters, and he was also entitled to an introductory token and the need to get to the supply department to receive basic equipment. The future hunter, accompanied by his boss, proceeded to the indicated department. They had to cross a long, busy street. The men walked silently along the cobblestones. Jafir thought about how last time he hadn't gotten into the raiding party, since he had risen to the rank of a member of the hunting party after the lists of those participating in the raid had been announced. Since about 20 people will be taken from the group of hunters, therefore, in order to get into the raid group, the guy will have to try hard. He even had a plan, but Jeffer didn't know when exactly he could start implementing it. Got stopped and pointed to the line in the supply department where Jeffer should go, and the hunter himself had to go to the infirmary. He would need to report that Dale and Marco were undergoing treatment. Just as the man was about to add that they could take some things with them, both noticed a group of church people heading their way. Suddenly, for Jafir, Goth grabbed him by the top of his head, forcing him to lower his head down, bowing to the men. The footsteps of a small crowd were heard, and the noise in the street died down. Group of people in long black robes and hoods, among whom was a half-naked giant with a mace in his hand, passed by in a crowd bowing before them. Sakak walked ahead of the whole group. The long hem of his cloak fluttered in the wind. He just passed by Jafir, who obediently lowered his head. The man's eyes suddenly widened, and he himself did not understand why he was so excited. The cloaks passed forward and the hunters raised their heads. Goth exhaled in relief. He explained to Jafir that these people were the Inquisitor of Heresy's authorized agents. They were slaves who were directly subordinate to the Inquisitor. But these are not simple slaves. It is better to treat them as such to the nobles. Under the pretext of searching for heresy, these bastards have the right to kill ordinary slaves without warning. There are rumors of people being cut down just because they accidentally push the Inquisitor's authorized representatives with their shoulders. The craziest of them is Sahak, nicknamed Mad Dog. They say that he started working for the Inquisitor only out of a thirst for killing. If he notices someone, he will go to the end and bite their throat, so Jafir should have kept this in mind. Suddenly, the entire group, which had managed to move far away, stopped, and Sahak, without turning around, shouted something. A second later, the dog turned around sharply, glaring at Goth and his companion. Beads of sweat immediately ran down the man's forehead, and his heart tried to burst out of his chest. Could it be that they heard him? Sahak kept getting closer to them, and as he walked, he began to speak, and he dismissively asked for forgiveness, saying that he was interested in something. Approaching Jeffer, he pointed his finger at the guy who was dressed in miner's rags. The heretic Inquisitor's confidant removed his hood and introduced himself, then asked the miner to state his name and rank. Jafir narrowed his eyes, looking fearlessly at Sahak. Got stuttered out his companion's name, explaining that he had just joined his group and that if there were any problems, he would Commander. Mad Dog didn't let him finish, rudely cutting him off mid-sentence. His face instantly lit up with such anger, as if he was ready to incinerate everyone around him with one glance. The man ordered the hunter to shut up, since he was not talking to him. It seemed to go to that the figure of the man in front of him stretched out, that this slave was ready to tear him to pieces, foremouth open at the wrong time. The hunter felt his whole body freeze and his breathing become ragged, as if he saw in front of him not a man, but a predator. What kind of deadly energy was this? Right before the eyes of the crowd of thousands, the leader of the hunting party, who had not been touched by a finger, staggered as if from a blow. Sahak kept his eyes on Jefir, and when he remained standing with his back straight and proud, he was sure of his suspicions. Even when the guy was just standing there, it was immediately obvious that he was not as simple as he might seem at first glance. Others would hardly notice such a thing, but the Inquisitor's confidant had no equal in the acuteness of his feelings. This man is in torn and miner's clothes. He was an incomparable master whose powerful energy, comparable in strength to a dragon, was seething over the edge. Even though he was wearing a miner's outfit, he had just been transferred to the hunter's group. He was originally in the miner's group. New slaves who first arrive at the temple are assigned a place after a skill test. Both physical and magical strength are tested. Those who can fight are given the opportunity to show their skills in action, because the group of hunters is always in need of people. So this slave first worked in the church and then was appointed as a member of the hunting party? All this seemed suspicious and unnatural to Sahak. In the blink of an eye, the entire group of the Inquisitor's slaves disbanded. A few seconds later, without warning, they suddenly surrounded Jafir. This guy seemed to be a strong fighter, but not to the extent that the dog couldn't handle him. The man decided to ask the slave a few questions. He also ordered to answer honestly and not lie, to which Jafir smiled raggedly, thinking that this freak would now regret what he said. And so, the close Inquisitor had some questions for an ordinary hunter. The man approached Jafir, a wide grin on his face. Sahak asked the boy if he had heard anything about worshippers of the demon god. Oh yes, Jeffrey knew about them better. Thangor. The followers of the demon god are people who worship Tartaros, his greatest enemy, traitors to humanity who will lead all people to defeat in the Great War. However, for now, they are known only as heretics, hostile to the current religious order. Slowly approaching the boy, Sahak ingratiatingly explained that these people have several differences from all other people. He said that he had gained recognition for quickly finding these differences, and thus became a subordinate of Master Matthias, the Inquisitor of Heresy. Crazy Eyes measured the figure of Jeffir. Dog said that his instinct told him that the guy was dangerous type. He immediately pulled a long dagger from its sheath and extended his hand forward. Now, as the executive person of the Inquisitor, Sahak will conduct the interrogation, so let the hunter keep in mind that every word or action can be used far from in his favor. After a few seconds of silence, Jeffir asked if he had the opportunity to ask something. Another slave from the group, angered by his actions, almost attacked the guy with a sword, calling him son of a dog, but Sahak waved his hand, allowing Jeffir to speak. He asked if they could change places for a warm conversation. Without taking his dagger away, the Inquisitor's confidant wondered why this was necessary. The hunter noticed with a smile that there were too many spectators gathered here on the street. Staring at Sahak, Jafir said that he was afraid. You never know. If something indecent happened here, the executive person of the Inquisitor could end up in a very uncomfortable position. The dog's eyes widened in rage. How dare this freak? He chuckled, baring his teeth, noticing that the guy had a lot of confidence since he thought he could handle 5 of them on his own. Saying that the more often he meets such people, the more he feels the benefit of his work, the man got into a fighting stance, ready to attack. Even the air around him became electrified from his energy. A red field in the form of a triangle with various symbols appeared on the paving stones, and Jeffir was in its center. 3 cloaked figures controlled the electrical charge of the field using magical knobs on their daggers. It was a red field skill, the power of abilities located inside the ally's field. The holding time and the boost effect depends on the number of people using the skill. It was activated as a special attribute due to a lack of user understanding. Jafir narrowed his eyes. He didn't move. He only said that this was already interesting. He tensed his palms and waved them several times. The smile never left the boy's face as he assumed a fighting stance. For a moment it seemed that Sahak was surprised. This combat technique seemed strange to him. He should have observed it first, but any thick-headed idiot might think so. The man laughed and ran, advancing straight towards Jeffir. He didn't care, because inside the red field he was invincible. He pulled his hand with the dagger back, using acceleration. Flashes appeared in the air just before Sahak jumped. A hunter approached him. His palm slid down, his expressionless gaze following the dog. He sharply dodged the attack. Jafir leaned forward, his palms moving with incredible speed. Another movement almost hit Sahak, passing right over his face. Jeffir ran back, keeping an eye on his enemy. The man twisted and turned, clutching the dagger in his hand. Then he covered the distance between himself and his opponent in a few jumps, putting his leg forward. Sahaka was triumphant and smiled, confident of his victory. But the next moment, the crazy eyes widened in shock. He tried to knock the hunter off his feet with this technique, but he couldn't do it, because the guy's leg didn't even move, as if he was made of iron. To Sahak's great regret, in those seconds that he hesitated, Jafir managed to group himself. The next moment, blows rained down on the slave as if he was being beaten not by one person but by a huge crowd. The man threw his head back sharply, coughing and choking on his own blood. His hand involuntarily unclenched, the sword falling from his weakened fingers. The hunter took a stance and pulled his bloody fist back, looming over the man. Sahak was lying on the ground unconscious. Got shouted, warning Jafira of danger to the right. The boy covered his head with his hand when a mace on a chain flew at him. He straightened up, glancing towards the giant who had attacked him. The hunter jumped back, still covering himself with his hand. From a distance, he saw a loutish slave swinging a mace, aiming at the boy. A man with a bloodthirsty face covered in scars called Jeffir to him, demanding that they play together. He smiled, got into a fighting stance, and mockingly shouted at the giant, very surprised that he could talk. Otherwise, it seemed that the man was just a little dog raised by that little idiot. The slave stopped smiling and, screaming furiously, threw the mace, holding onto the chain towards Jeffir. The heavy spiked weapon made a hole in the cobblestones, and the guy managed to run to the side. The people standing on the sides of the street began to fuss in fear, trying to escape the stones flying in all directions. Goth, who thought that nothing could surprise him anymore, was once again amazed by this scary guy. Looking at the unconscious mad dog, he thought about what he had realized back in the dungeons, that Jafir was no slouch. But this time he had so quickly laid out the Inquisitor's pawn with some strange techniques. Even now, as the big guy named Morningstar Flail pounded the ground with all his might with a mace, Jafir fought off absolutely all the stones flying at him. A few seconds later, he moved his leg to the side, knocking the mace itself away. Covering his mouth with his hand, God smiled. He would win now. And Sahak himself, when he woke up, would burn with shame, and his pride would not allow him to report this to the higher-ups and provide an arrest warrant. Finally, the man, without even hiding, waved his fist. Let Jafir win, and these freaks will leave him alone and let him not dare lose. Otherwise, they'll grab him and the guy as an accomplice. A stranger in the crowd who stood next to the hunter laughed and cursed, telling Gott that his friend was unlucky. Although the guy fights off all attacks like crazy, his problem started a few minutes ago. Jafir seemed not to notice that Flail was feeding on the power of the field, as was the chain of his weapon. The guy's outstretched arms were immediately wrapped in a magical chain. Trying to extricate himself, he only became more entangled in it. Opposite him stood a smiling giant, clutching his mace tightly. The red field gave the slave's bodies extraordinary strength. Bending his knee, Flail pulled the long chain towards himself with all his might. Jafir's feet began to slide on the cobblestones, kicking up small stones into the air. But he didn't even allow himself a second's hesitation, without blinking an eye. While the boy was focusing on Flail, a red flash appeared behind him. After all, thanks to the work of the red field, these bastards are getting stronger with every second. And as confirmation of this, a huge cut appeared on Jeffrey's back, and blood spurted out. It was Sahak who woke up and managed to wound the hunter with a dagger. The man hissed happily and announced that the jokes were over. After wiping the alien blood off the dagger, the temple minion said that he would make Jafir regret not asking to be thrown behind bars from the very beginning. Standing in a stance and drawing his dagger back, Sahak turned towards the boy who was still chained up. The man ran towards him using his acceleration. Approaching Jafir, he began to wield the dagger with inhuman speed, appearing in different parts of the field. The guy couldn't catch a glimpse of his opponent while he was flying around him and laughing madly because Jafir couldn't even see him. The next moment, the hunter felt a cut on his cheek. Sahak, running past, looked at him with a grin, boasting that his abilities had now increased by 80%, that no tricks would work against his incredible speed. He continued to cover the warrior's body with more and more cuts, wishing for him to die in agony. Still laughing, he flew straight at Jafir. But the next second, the hunter's clasped fists fell on his head. The blow was so strong that the man was slammed into the asphalt, and many stones flew around. Saliva poured from Sahak's mouth. His eyes rolled back in agony. Grabbing the man's wheat-colored hair, Jafir kneed him in the face. He asked what kind of disgusting teamwork slaves had. Sahak's head fell back. He sprayed blood around himself, his fading consciousness wondering why neither his speed nor his red field defense worked. Finally, the man, with a shameful groan, fell face down on the damaged floor, and Jafir, with his hands tied, spat out that, due to flying like flies, the big guy had already died of boredom. The guy added that if the slave wanted to boast about his speed, he could have done it in a less shameful way. Flail's voice rang out, cursing at Jafir as he pulled on the chains. He ordered the hunter to come to him, and tightened the iron more and more. Jafir straightened up, attracting the big guy's attention with a shout. He strained his palms as hard as he could, asking why Flail wasn't doing anything with her size. The guy smiled and asked if he was afraid to come closer. If his subordinates had shown such teamwork in their past life, Jafir would have finished them off long ago. He pulled the chains towards himself sharply, using the combat method of magic control, amplification. The chains were thrown upwards by such force. Flail fell on his backside, letting go of the mace. She began to knock down the remaining figures that were holding the field in a circle. When the haze cleared, Jafir stood in the street, throwing his chains aside to the astonished gaze of the crowd. Around him, temple slaves lay on the ground, barely conscious. The guy was breathing heavily, looking around at the people. Sahak, barely raising himself on his elbow, covered in wounds, asked Jafir, damn him, who he was and what his true face was. He smiled and replied that he had expected more interesting questions during the man's interrogation. But in the end, that was all he was interested in. Turning his back on the enraged henchmen of the Inquisition, Jafir mockingly said that he had no right to know about this. From the tower window hidden in the shadows, Inquisitor Matthias watched the battle. Long hair fell over the man's shoulders, and he covered his mouth with his hand in shock. Could it be that same person who sent this guy here? Everyone present on the street could not believe their eyes. How was this even possible? Mr. Sahak lost and lay on the ground, hissing angrily and clenching his fists. Sweat beaded thickly onto the damaged floor as the man sobbed. Jafir smiled when he heard Sahak's mad cries behind him, cursing him. The guy thought he was very vocal. So, the first stage of the plan was completed. But the problem was that now the hunter had no idea when what had happened would reach the ears of that freak. Jafir came out to a narrow path by the water. Now the only problem was time. But something was wrong. The guy didn't notice it right away. He froze in shock. Then an incomprehensible force pinned him to the floor, forcing him to sit down. Jafir couldn't move a finger. A sharp pain and powerlessness ran through his entire body. It was a mana freeze.